Welcome, Ayubowan, which is today hosting a very special edition to discuss a very well-known area of Sri Lanka, the Knuckles. And Knuckles Mountains is a World Heritage Site declared by UNESCO, and it's a very special zone, but sadly, it's been impacted by climate change, which has affected not just Sri Lanka, but the whole world. And what's happened is there are about 30,000 farming communities that are living as highland farmers in the Knuckles mountain range, both as forest harvesters and also as indigenous paddy farmers. And I myself is a paddy farmer up in the Knuckles. So it's nice that the Stein Studios have invited a farmer to moderate this session with three internationally renowned scientists who have come together here to help Sri Lanka install a new program to restore the Knuckles watershed. So I would like to first throw the question to one of the eminent guests we have here, is our very own Sri Lankan scientist, Dr. Ranil Siranayake, who is the father of analog forestry as a concept that he introduced borrowing from Sri Lanka's Candian home garden concept that has been practiced here for ages, particularly in the Matale district. And he has been advocating different solutions to restore our degraded rainforest areas as well as the montane forest areas in the Knuckles. So I'd like to ask Ranil, what's so special about Knuckles, and why is Knuckles getting impacted by climate change, and what do you think climate change is? Could you explain it very simplistically to our audience? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. There's about 5 questions there, but I'll endeavor to tackle them. Knuckles is special because it's almost a detached part of the Central Highlands. It got detached basically by the Mahavali River. The thing with the Knuckles is that the soil is very distinct, and the soil, the topsoil, is easily erodible. We saw this with the tea plantations coming in there, where most of the topsoil was. Now, why do I say there was a deep topsoil here? Because the Knuckles, out of all the places in Sri Lanka, has the largest amount of earth snakes that live in the soil, or once lived in the soil there, over 12 species. And earth snakes are like whales in an ocean to the soil. They are the huge, the biggest organisms of the soil, and they demonstrate that the soil is healthy. And looking at these indicators, we know that the topsoil of the Knuckles has now been washed away, and it has to be rebuilt. And that's why we think this is so important. But answering to your question on climate change, we are in a terrible bind right now, because the temperatures of the world are going, and Sri Lanka is going to go beyond 40 degrees centigrade. After 40 degrees centigrade, chlorophyll, which is an enzyme, denatures, which means chlorophyll is an enzyme. It climbs in its performance up to 38, 39 degrees, and when you pass 39 degrees, it starts collapsing. What this suggests is that the future is going to be one without food, because without photosynthesis, food won't be created. So we are looking at creating ecosystems that can help balance the ambient temperature to ensure food productivity at least into the future to come. So this is one of the strong areas that we are looking at in terms of restoration of the ecosystems of the Knuckles.
So let me understand this, Ranil. So what you're saying is that the current ambient temperature
Yes.
that we experience when you go out into the open,
Correct.
that temperature is now in Sri Lanka is 82 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yep.
Right? So if it reaches to what point are you
Centigrade.
saying?
Let's
Yeah,
look at centigrade.
let's go with centigrade.
Yeah.
So 37 degrees
Yeah,
centigrade.
now it's 36, 37.
Yeah.
Once it passes 40,
Yeah.
you're in the danger zone. And the more it becomes past 40, the less possibility of the ecosystem to come back.
Correct.
So that means widespread starvation across the planet.
Thank you, Ranil. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Fergus Sinclair here to TB1, to share with us his experience and expertise as the chief scientist of C4ICRAF, which is the World Agroforestry Center based in Nairobi, Kenya, and also he's the chief advocate for agroecological initiatives throughout the UN system. And Professor Fergus has been associated with me in developing this Green Climate Fund project proposal, and his institution is now the advisor to the government of Sri Lanka. So, Professor Fergus, what are your experiences globally with respect to climate change impacts and how it affects agriculture, and what do you think of Knuckles, and why did you get involved in this Knuckles initiative?
Well, it's great to be here, Chris. And I want to focus on the double whammy of climate change that Sri Lanka faces.
Okay.
We did a fine-scale analysis in the preparation of the GCF project that shows that in key months of the year, in the upper parts, wet zone of the country, there's going to be more and more intense rainfall, creating problems with flooding and sedimentation flow down to reservoirs. And the problem with sedimentation of reservoirs is it reduces the storage capacity of the reservoir. And that means there's less water available for irrigation downstream, where the key rice growing happens for the country. It's where the food security for Sri Lanka comes from. And the double whammy part of this is that at the same time as you're getting that more intense rainfall in the uplands, at key growing months in the dry zone, it's getting hotter and the rainfall is getting less reliable. And that means that you actually have a higher water requirement for growing crops. So you're getting a double hit there, and we need to do something about it.
Right.
And of course, the critical thing is to work with nature rather than against nature. And that's why the Green Climate Fund is investing in ecosystem-based adaptation, adapting the upland catchment to this higher rainfall, more erosive rainfall. And that means changing land use, putting in measures to control surface water flow across land, to make better use of the water in the catchment, and to protect the reservoir storage capacity.
So Fergus, from your experience internationally, do you see this same pattern in a worse form in other countries, or is Sri Lanka actually at peril because it's getting impacted from the Indian subcontinent's turbulent weather patterns?
Well, I think the critical thing about Sri Lanka is that since ancient times, you've had this incredible water system where you store water and you transfer it effectively from the wet zone to the dry zone where the production happens. And that's a fairly unique situation. Now, there are many countries that are very badly impacted, particularly dry areas of Africa, for example, that are getting drier as a result of climate change. But because even in a relatively small distance here in Sri Lanka, you've got these differential impacts that are going on, it's going to hit food security really hard unless you take steps now to adapt land use in order to address this climate change catastrophe, which will happen if we don't take measures immediately.
So what are those steps and what are those measures, Professor, that you are proposing for Sri Lanka?
Well, the first thing, when we came and we started working with the Ministry of Irrigation and with, in fact, a whole load of different parts of government and science here in Sri Lanka, you may remember there was the Land Health is National Wealth workshop which
I hosted when I was heading UNEP
did,
at the time.
And so that was a joint venture between
That's
ICRAF
right.
and UNEP. And what was fantastic about that is that we had everybody from the medical sector, the health sector, the water sector,
approach.
agriculture, forestry, you name it, all getting together. And the interesting thing was everybody had their own story to tell about problems that were being created by intensive agriculture, leading to pollution issues, health issues in the country. But it was only when they started talking to one another that we could come up with integrated solutions to tackle these sort of problems. So, what is it that the GCF project is going to stimulate here in Sri Lanka? And I think it's really important that these solutions have to be sustainable. So one of the critical issues is, how do you generate value from the water that is yielded from the catchment, that's very valuable for people? It's valuable for generating hydroelectricity, it's valuable as drinking water, it's valuable for irrigating crops in the dry zone. But none of that value goes back to protecting the catchment from which the water comes. And that's why a new payment for environmental services scheme is being introduced in order to take some of the money that is paid for generating hydroelectricity and redirecting it back to help farmers to manage land in ways that reduce that sediment flow and so protect the water yield. So the users of water are getting the benefit of the reservoirs being protected, and the farmers in the upper catchment and other land users are getting the benefit of assistance in being able to manage their land more sustainably.
Thank you, Professor Fergus. I mean, that, in a nutshell, is the issue, is about the quantum of water, how much of that falls, and how much of that flows. So in that context, I would like to now turn to Professor Sirimal Premakumara, a scientist I admire a lot because he's researched the indigenous rice varieties in this country, over 200 varieties of rice, and the beneficial, the health benefits, as well as the growing conditionalities that it can withstand droughts as well as floods and high precipitation levels. Professor, you are also the chairman of the Knuckles Advisory Board that advises the Mahabali Authority with respect to implementing the organic zone in the Kaluganga Reservoir. Plus, you are a secondary metabolites expert and you understand the value of crops, the aroma, the taste, the medicinal properties. I mean, what makes Sri Lanka so special in both our agricultural economy, plantation economy, and the pharmaceutical industry to come is the special characteristics of the plants that we grow here. And every single value that we have on our soils, whether it is minerals or agricultural outputs, it has the highest levels of quality by any metric that you measure. So tell us how you see the climate change impacting negatively or positively towards the very crops that we have to grow in watersheds like the Knuckles.
Well, let me thank TV1 for inviting me for this important discussion, and Chris, to you too, for inviting me for this discussion. Let me begin saying that the Sri Lanka is a biodiversity hotspot in this world, a well-recognized biodiversity hotspots. Now, within this biodiversity hotspot, the Knuckles range is a biodiversity hotspot, right? So why biodiversity is important is because we all depend on the biodiversity, right? And we see now this climate change is affecting the biodiversity in a different ways. And as you said, like, when it comes to phytochemistry, what matters actually, it is the phytochemistry that matters for whatever qualities that we see in the plant kingdom or the biodiversity. So this phytochemistry changes with the changes in the climate, the environment. So I have seen and I have read a lot on the changes that will happen due to this climate change will definitely affect the phytochemistry of the plant kingdom.
So Ceylon tea, for example, the very taste is what sells our Ceylon tea. So you're saying our Ceylon tea is at risk if the phytochemistry changes.
Yeah, exactly. So, whatever properties what we see in the plants, be it tea, be it medicinal plants, be it paddy, be it fruits, vegetables, whatever, the reason is the unique phytochemistry that they produce, right? So, these environmental changes affect the phytochemistry in terms of quality as well as the quantity, right? If you take a medicinal plant, right, so you need to have a certain quantity of that particular bioactive molecule uh, to be effective at the end of the day, right? And in formulation especially, you use different medicinal plants, but if you don't have that particular active component in the quantities that is required, your formulation will not be effective.
So what you're
So,
saying is that the environmental changes are negatively impacting on the phytochemistry.
yes.
What about the anthropogenic activities of people using high toxic pesticides and insecticides that's killing the soils?
Yes.
Which is also, I believe, is going to affect
Yes.
and impact negatively on the plants?
Yes, that is the other part of the story actually, the human involvement in destroying the balanced ecosystems. So there again you see these effects, right? Especially when you apply these synthetic components into your soil, the soil microbiome affect largely, and it is the balance between the environmental factors and the living microbiome within the soil that finally decide the phytochemistry of that plant. So if you compromise with the existing the biota, underground, that will be seriously affect the phytochemistry of that plant.
What sort of program would you recommend for the knuckles with respect to doing the baseline assessment to understand the vulnerability that we are facing? What would you suggest that we should do
Yeah, I think-
to make that assessment?
Yeah, I think this is a good opportunity for us to study this the effects of human involvement and the climate change in this particular project, because you have in knuckles you have certain areas where are untouched. So there you have the biodiversity that has been there for millenniums.
So that's a good point to throw the question back at Ranil. So what would you recommend in terms of the baseline indicators that we should look at, and how should that get structured?
Okay, Chris, let me respond first to your question, and that is the baselines. Baselines are important because we want to know where we started and then at some period of time where we got to. The baselines will tell us whether we are successful or whether we are not in what we were doing. That's why it's important. In a thing like the knuckles, one of the most important things, as Fergus said, is the water. So if there's water, we need gauging stations at critical points to find out where is the pollution or the sediment coming from. That kind of design has to be done and set the baselines. Other thing is indicators, indicator species. For instance, as I said, the earth snakes, there are many amphibians, there are many fish, there are many aquatic organisms that can serve as indicator because they indicate whether an environment is degrading or whether it's recovering. Now, why indicator species? Because indicator species means the same thing then to the scientist and the farmer. If the farmer is told, if you see these fish in the stream, your stream is clean. If these fish disappear, we got poisons coming in. This is the way we can interact with the community and have the community benefit from the research that we are doing and from our measure of baseline. I would like to go quickly to the point that Fergus raised on the intensity of rainfall and the lowlands. This country, this nation is amazingly blessed by its geographical location and by its history. We have mountains in the center of the country which collect the oceanic moisture and deposit it on the mountains. In the old days, nobody touched the mountains. It was left in forest because that's where the rainfall accumulated and drained down into the valley.
The Knuckles is, we have 103 rivers in Sri Lanka. The Mahawali River flows at the edge of Knuckles, and there are feeder tributaries, Telangamoya, the Suduganga, Amban Ganga, and Kaluganga. And these are the river basins that the Knuckles nurtures. So if you look at watersheds of Sri Lanka, we have river basins, 103 river basins, and then you have sub-watersheds for each river basin. Can you explain as to how we need to look at the restoration of those watersheds, right? And maybe I'd like to throw that question at Professor Fergus, because you'll be looking at that.
Okay. In terms of the watersheds, I can say from my personal experience, when I did my research in the Knuckles, I find that the Kaluganga had endemic species of fishes. Barbus srilankensis, which I described as a new species, Barbus martinsteinii. Now, this indicates that there was an isolation of these unique river valleys before they hit the Mahawali. And this generally was ignored by the irrigation people because their concern was volume of water.
Quantum of water.
Quantum of water. Now, if you look, as I said, at these micro watersheds, there are some that are so clean, I mean, you can directly drink from it, it's potable water. And the indicators are Barbus srilankensis, Barbus martinsteinii. These are fishes that disappear as soon as the water quality goes down. And I use them to identify the polluted watersheds and the unpolluted watersheds, learn to differentiate them because the response that we have has to be totally different to each.
I hear you, because I think one of the key issues that Sri Lanka, the farming community of Sri Lanka faces is chronic kidney diseases, cancers, a lot of non-communicable diseases, which is decimating the farming population. We may not have farmers alive to do farming in this country if they continue to get sick. And so this point that Ranil just raised about the quality of water,
Yes.
as opposed to the quantum of water. And I think the Mahawali Authority and the Minister of Irrigation has now taken on board that they need to focus on the quality of water. So Fergus, what are the areas that you have recommended in which the quality of water can be preserved?
Now, we've got some modern approaches to indicators that we're developing now within this GCF project. So there is an ability today to use light spectroscopy to do very high throughput soil sampling. So you can do hundreds of thousands of samples very, very quickly. Big advance from wet chemistry, which is much, much slower. And that means that we can train algorithms. This is machine learning, it's artificial intelligence, but you can use very modern technology to analyze satellite images using the spectral data from your soil sampling, and that can tell you in real time what is happening in terms of soil organic carbon in your across the Knuckles catchment. It can tell you about erosion prevalence. Where is the soil coming from that's then being taken down to sediment the reservoirs. So that land degradation surveillance framework, as we call it, is a way of bringing evidence into decision making so that the people who are deciding about what interventions to make in the catchment can target those interventions to the areas that are most vulnerable in terms of erosion. And it's really significant that if you want to manage watersheds, you've got a critical problem in Sri Lanka because the administrative units don't have the same boundaries as the natural watersheds. So you actually need to combine different administrative units in order to get decisions that allow you to be sensible in terms of the management of water in a particular area. So some innovations in governance are as important as on-the-ground measures to control surface water
I hear
flow.
you, Fergus, I hear you. I think, Ranil, you were going to make a point on something that Fergus
I just
raised.
wanted to make a point, Fergus, and that is this is fine, but we are also dealing with a whole lot of farmers who are fairly unlettered. What we generate must be meaningful to them as much as it is to the bureaucrat or the administrator. So my suggestion is, as you check this thing remotely, ground truthing is essential. If you're looking at the soil, then the soil microorganisms never turn up you cannot do that.
You're absolutely right, Ranil, because and you know what we found
Yes.
is that when we compare farmers' knowledge about
Yes.
where erosion is happening
Exactly.
with the scientific assessment, we find a really good
Exactly.
congruence.
Now-
and so it's absolutely about bringing the science and the local knowledge together
It's not-
in order to make the best decisions and to be able to validate
Exactly.
the
But it must go
payments.
the other way too. We must use science to empower and increase the local knowledge. So, for instance, look at the fish. I'll give you an example. In my research, I have found Babustitia, fairly common fish, found in the southwestern zone, right? It's present in the water, everybody sees it, a little red fish. If it disappears, it means water quality is going down rapidly. Now, as scientists, we knew this early, but we have to then extend it to the indicator species that are meaningful to the community who's living there and observing it, not just the data that we are going to throw at them. That's what I would like this project to be doing.
Absolutely, and I think that
you.
participatory approach
Good.
is absolutely central, not only in terms of indicators, but also in terms of what interventions are actually feasible.
Fergus, I think you brought a number of issues that needs to be discussed because each of them are important issues. But I want to go back to the baseline survey technologies that need to be deployed, and you were talking about spectroscopy. Ranil was talking about ground truthing it on the ground. So let me ask the head of ITI, which is the Sri Lanka's foremost peer-reviewed laboratory that is accepted globally for maintaining consistent standards, even in a wet test that you carry out. What is your view about these green climate funds being utilized to bring technology that ICRAF is recommending to be placed here in the knuckles so that we can have an evidence-based program to be implemented in the knuckles? What about this equipment that...
Yes, Chris. Now, I have been trying to source available resources for this project from the universities as well as from my own institute and other research institutes. So, what Fergus showed that the need of a high throughput analysis, because in the wet lab you can't do this high throughput analysis like thousands and thousands of samples. What is actually needed to be analyzed in this project. So, for that kind of analysis, as he pointed out, we need this spectroscopy type high-end equipments to be installed in Sri Lanka. So, in the ITI, of course, we are accredited for soil testing, we are accredited for water testing. So, we have the ISO 17025 accreditation across the border. All test parameters are accredited, but we can do it. But only thing, at that scale and that rate, it's not possible for us to do unless we have high-end equipment like what Fergus pointed out, the spectroscopy-based analysis of soil samples.
That's very good. I think that leads us to end our first part of our conversation, which will lead us to the second part to discuss the solutions for the problems that have been identified. And clearly the technological solutions are part of the answer, but not the whole answer. So with that, we'll take a break and we'll come back to discuss the exciting part of both the challenges and opportunities to restore a watershed such as the knuckles. Thank you. Welcome back to TV1's special edition where we're discussing the most topical subject today, climate change and how it's impacting on watersheds. And in Sri Lanka, we are focused on the knuckles that has got the GCF Green Climate Fund, which is a UNFCCC institution that has provided funding to do the restoration of our knuckles watershed. So let me go back to where the discussion was with Professor Sirimal Premakumara of ITI, where we were talking about what types of technologies need to be deployed for you as the head of ITI to be able to carry out the baseline studies in a scientific manner.
Chris, now if you look at the strengths what we have at ITI, so we are basically having most of the high-end equipments for soil, water and air analysis. So we didn't discuss about the air quality. So we do have facilities to a substantial level for analysis of all three important parameters. But when it comes to now the genome analysis is extremely important in this project, because we don't know what will happen to the genome as such, due to the climate change that is going to happen, because maybe certain genes will be switched on unnecessarily, maybe certain genes switched off at certain the levels and the reasons. So those will have to be analyzed. So to begin with, of course, I think we need to have this high-end spectroscopic facility to start this baseline study. And if we can source it parallelly, of course, I would rather like if you can do it in parallel. But the first, the spectroscopic analysis is what is needed immediately, because for the baseline study, I think we have to focus mainly on the soil
Biophysical parameters.
Biophysical parameters on all these three aspects. But the genome is extremely important, because we don't know what will happen to the existing genetic expression of the plant and the microbial genomes.
So therefore, Fergus, as you can hear from Professor Sirimal Premakumara, the apex scientific body head of ITI, he says that the genome sequencing is going to be very, very critical component for this project. And how do you see this economic opportunity that can be derived when you do bring that equipment for this project?
Well, I think it's very interesting that we're mentioning here two distinct uses of genomic analysis. One relates to the vegetation, to plants. And we have a strategy at ICRAF on diversity breeding, and also understanding conservation in relation to genetic diversity. But not just taxonomic genetic diversity, but also functional diversity. And that becomes really important when we start looking at the soil microbiome, because that's what's, the soil is alive. And in fact, there are more organisms in a handful of soil
than the whole population of the world.
Indeed. It's an incredibly diverse medium. And it's really important that we understand more about that functionality, and that we can monitor and see whether the agriculture that we're doing is maintaining that key microbial diversity that provides the ecosystem service functions that we need in terms of maintaining soil health through to the future, so that our children and their children will still have a soil resource that they can utilize into the future. So we're right on the cusp of again, it's cutting edge science to understand that functional relationship between the genetic sequences that we get from putting samples through a machine that tells us what the genetic material is in that sample, through to being able to interpret that in terms of soil functions.
So clearly, Fergus, unlike many of the international donors who put money, we are very lucky that the Green Climate Fund does not impose conditionalities of taking data back to themselves and so forth, because there's always a concern in Sri Lanka when there's an international organization donating high technology equipment, whether it is a data exodus, right? There's no such thing here, right? There are no such stipulations whatsoever.
Well, let's be absolutely clear. The stipulations are completely the other way around.
Yes.
And that is that this project is all about building capacity in Sri Lanka for Sri Lankans to exploit. It's not in any way an extractive process.
Absolutely.
It's very important that everything that's done in the project is sustainable. And that's why there are three arms to the project. The central arm, if you like, or pillar, is the actual interventions on the ground in Knuckles to improve land use, which will result in higher income for farmers and better management of water flow across the
and resilience to climate change.
And resilience to climate change. Now, if you're going to sustain those activities, that good watershed management, then you need to be able to finance it. And not just finance it during the lifetime of the project, but finance it beyond. And that's why we have the Payment for Environmental Services scheme that I mentioned earlier. But that's not the only way in which you can sustain the better land management. The other way is what we call value chain upgrading. And that is ensuring that farmers are capturing more value from the products that they produce. And I was actually visiting Ranel's Forest Garden certification scheme, up in, and that's an example of where farmers can add value to products because if they're sustainably produced and produced in a healthy way that people feel is a higher value product that they're prepared to pay for, then you get more money. The same thing is happening with local roasting of coffee, production of local chocolate and so on from cocoa that's grown locally. So getting more of the value addition closer to the farmer means that you keep more value, you generate more value within the catchment. And that, of course, then means that you've got more scope for sustainable productivity. And then the third pillar, which is equally critical, is governance. You need appropriate governance mechanisms and advice for farmers. Now, traditionally in Sri Lanka, you've had fairly big agroecological zones and you tend to have a recommendation for the zone. You know? This is what everybody
One size
should do.
fits all.
One size fits all. And what the GCF project is doing is what we call options by context. And that recognizes that not all farmers are the same, that soils vary at a very fine scale from one place to another. So what you need in one place is slightly different from what you need somewhere else. But to support that, the rural advisory services need to have a rather different approach, a more knowledge-intensive approach than we've been used to previously. And it means working much closer with farmers to evaluate the technologies that are being used in the context in which they happen. And because of advances in information technology now and communications technology, you can collect, it's citizen science. You can collect lots of information from lots of farmers on their mobile phones telling you whether this is better than that for them. So they might be trying a particular crop, they may be trying a particular way of managing it, and they can say, this is working better for me. The next farmer, it may be a different technology. And through analyzing that big data, we can then begin to see what are the contextual factors that are controlling the performance of different technologies. So we can customize recommendations and opportunities, what we offer farmers to their local circumstances, like a custom tailoring.
So it's a dashboard, it's a governance dashboard that will have real-time dynamic data streams that will accurately reflect the status quo of the land that each farmer is engaged in.
It's not so much status quo, Chris. Right. It's the trends. It's the changes.
Yes.
It's what is you can actually track in real time.
Status quo in time intervals.
Yeah, right. and what you're coming on to there is evidence-based decision making. So you can see whether the interventions that you've taken have had an impact on, for example, sediment flow. And that's really important because that allows adaptive management. That allows you to say, well, this is working here, it's not working there, let's adapt so that we make sure that the interventions that we're making are being as effective as possible.
So now this is the challenge, because you have the Agrarian Services Department in Sri Lanka and the Mahavali Authority with its Director of Agriculture. These people are governed by the Director of Agriculture, the Agricultural Ministry, who stipulate what can be grown, what inputs can be utilized, etc. So there is a change management that we need to put in place so that they understand options by context and adaptive management based on an evidence-based model where these recommendations have to be
And that's where
informed decisions.
Yes, and that's, Chris, where this shared approach. So shared is an evidence-based decision-making program. But as Ranil was mentioning earlier, the key point about it is it's participatory. So you get people around the evidence. It's not just one or two people making all the decisions, but you try to then broaden the decision base and make sure that people are making decisions based on the evidence rather than on prejudices or
Therefore, the mobile phone becomes the repository, the access point for farmers to get that information.
Yes, and also for them to give information
Absolutely.
as well. It's a two-way process.
Yes.
Yeah?
So you will be deploying that sort of technology. Now, Ranil has been talking about, when you talked about payment for ecosystem services, I mean, we were quite lucky actually at the genesis of this project proposal being submitted to the Green Climate Fund. We recommended to the government of Sri Lanka to proactively demonstrate to the global community that Sri Lanka is going to take the first step in defining a payment for ecosystem services. So what we did was we got the Mahavali Authority to identify the mini hydros that are operating, including the Mahavali's Moragahakanda mini hydro 9 watt and megawatt generating power plants, to pay a percentage of the revenue they earn by selling electricity to the CEB as a payment for ecosystem services that gets paid to the communities living in the upper catchment area for protecting that catchment reservoir and also ensuring that there's no sediments coming through and the water output, the yield is higher because they are effectively regenerating forest areas up there. So for the first time in the world, I think Sri Lanka has demonstrated to the world its commitment to follow payment for ecosystem services. And I believe, Fergus, that went well. So with the Green Climate Fund. So I want to now bring to your attention there's a similar but a more innovative payment for ecosystem services that Dr. Ranil Saranaka has proposed, which he thinks could also benefit the Knuckles farmers. Could you explain that to us?
Certainly. When in this whole question of ecosystem services, most of the values are subjective. There's no real hard evidence or hard values to say this service is worth this much, this service is worth that much. So therefore, we looked at this whole question and thought all ecosystem services begin at one point. That point is photosynthesis, primary productivity. From there flows everything else. So we focused on primary productivity, and we are now looking at the service, the primary service, which is the creation of oxygen, the release of oxygen, the trapping of solar energy, the really cleaning of water, and the creation of dynamic carbon. These we can measure by gram or by kilogram, and we can contract. So using primary ecosystem services, the first set of ecosystem services, we have now created a possibility for farmers to be paid for 4 years for looking after one tree. Tree planting today beggars a rural community. Everybody rushes out, plants 1 million trees at 50 cents or $1 a tree and goes away saying we planted 1 million or 1 billion. Survival rate, 1%, 5%, etc. What we looked at is no, We said the people who can look after the trees and grow them are the rural people. We must pay them for doing that job. It's a recognition of the value of the rural people, the value of the rural population in contributing to creating something that all of us require: oxygen, clean water, food.
So like carbon credits, you're now talking about oxygen credits,
It-
similar
Similar,
platform.
but not carbon credit, because carbon credits, as I said, is a scam.
Yeah.
Because nobody has shown the differentiation of fossil carbon and biotic carbon. Everybody says, oh, they're the same. They're not. They're totally different. And that is why we are in the problem we are in now, because carbon trading just gives a little blanket, for people to feel good, while the polluters carry on polluting.
Yeah. So therefore, what you're proposing with respect to the oxygen,
Productivity, real productivity, measured productivity.
which then can be paid to the rural farmers
It
as a
is-
payment for ecosystem
It
services.
is paid to the rural farmer. In fact, today, one tree in this economy is worth $130, out of which 80% goes to the farmer over 4 years. It pays the highest amount for tree planting anywhere in the world, and it began here in Sri Lanka.
So I would think that in going into our next conclusive session after this, where I will be asking our eminent panelists here to give their perspective on summing up as to what should be done with respect to knuckles. Take a break. Welcome back. This has been a long discussion on the important subject of knuckles watershed restoration with the blessings of the Green Climate Fund. So, in conclusion, I would like to ask my three eminent scientists, starting with Professor at ITI, what's your view in terms of what this country needs to get out of this knuckles project?
Yeah, of course, Chris, now this knuckles project, as I see, is a huge opportunity for us to develop our manpower, the requirements of the country. Because we have a lot of opportunities, lot of diverse range of opportunities to look at PhD, MPhil, master's level. So that can be done through this project. And also the available resources, if you look at the manpower available right now, is actually when you look at the university system, you have the people with the knowledge that can be disposed to do this project. And if you take ITI, we have the required manpower right now to do the baseline study, but we also need to work on the potential
This is
projects.
kind of a living university. So you're saying
Yeah,
that
this can develop
tertiary,
to
a climate change university that the president is talking about, effectively you have an application here, a practical ground to demonstrate climate action, watershed restoration, soil sciences, drone operations, robotic engineering that goes into do soil testing in remote places, remote sensing. So there is a complete
so many,
opportunity
yeah, of
here,
course, yes.
right?
So many, yeah, of course.
Thank you. And I would like to, of course, give Professor Fergus, who is advisor to the government of Sri Lanka, what is your take on how this project will benefit this country, and what would be your singular focus?
Well, Chris, the project is a 6-year time frame, and it aims to benefit 2.4 million people. Those are the beneficiaries. What we need to make sure is that that happens. Now, you mentioned contributing to a climate change university, and I think there's a great opportunity for us to set up an exemplar landscape right from the word go, starting tomorrow, in which we have a center for diversity, productivity, and climate resilience at landscape scale, where we can showcase the key interventions that are required in order to adapt to climate change. And that is a quick win that we can start contributing to the President's vision that he announced in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 of Sri Lanka leading the way in terms of climate adaptation.
So that's your take on the output and outcome that Sri Lanka can potentially gain from this project, in addition to the climate resilience that you will build for the farmers.
Well, let us be absolutely clear. The primary benefit is to the people in the Knuckles catchment, the people in the areas that the irrigation water is being used. They are the primary beneficiaries. That will result in more food production, more sustainable food production, more nutritious food that will benefit the food security of the country as a whole. And by having it sustainably positioned with regard to high value coming back to farms and this new, very novel system for paying for the environmental services that the Knuckles catchment produces, we can sustain this into the future. And the critical thing is that the government of Sri Lanka and the people of Sri Lanka who own this project and its development see that through and have a sustainable future based on a green economy, which is sustainable rather than using
fossil fuel
fuel economy, which clearly is not.
Thank you, Fergus. And then the last word is yours, Ranil. And what's your view of a watershed, as you were saying, with the climate change impacting and the desertification trend line? How would this watershed be a preserve for Sri Lanka for its survival into the future?
Well, okay. I'd like to go historically. This project, when it began, it was having the people from the Green Climate Fund come to Sri Lanka. They looked at the country. They came up to Beli Pola. They worked in the analog forest and they asked the principles of analog forestry. And they said, this is what we want. When I visited them in Seoul, they repeated the same thing. We came to your place, this is what we want, analog forestry. I am hoping that through this project, Sri Lanka will be able not only to save ourselves by using this technique that we have developed ourselves, but extend it to the rest of the world as a gift.
Thank you, Ranil. So there you have it. You have heard from the three scientists, one from overseas, two locally, about what their views are about the opportunity we have in restoring one of the most famous watersheds of Sri Lanka that's globally known as Knuckles. So thank you, TV1, for us having this discussion, and I hope the audience here will keep a watching brief on what's going on at Knuckles, and we hope to have another periodic session later to see how much progress this project has made. Thank you.